Sikkim 365 and Baylor Plus have teamed up to bring Baylor fans the ultimate content bundle. You can sign up now for $17.99 a month, a $5 monthly savings, and get instant access to all premium content on both websites. For more information, visit either sikkim365.com or baylorplus.com today. What's up, Baylor fans? Welcome to Inside Baylor Sports, an official daily podcast of Baylor Athletics. It's Monday, November 4th, and this is our second podcast that we've recorded for today. This time we're going to talk about Baylor basketball. We've got the season starting tonight at 10:30 p.m. Central Time against Gonzaga. Really late game. It's actually out on the West Coast, so they're starting this one late on ESPN2 against Gonzaga, number 6 Gonzaga. Obviously a recent history with the Bulldogs and Mark Few between Scott Drew and the Baylor Bears. But I want to talk about what this season looks like. We've talked about it a little bit before, but just kind of bouncing some stuff off of you, starting with the basics. Let's start about this starting five that we potentially see tonight from Baylor. What Scott Drew's got, a lot of new faces, transfers, some guys returning, and freshmen. Very talented team. But as of today, going into this game against Gonzaga, how do you look at the starting five? For Scott Drew, who's usually throughout the season pretty consistent, barring injuries, of what his starting five looks like throughout the season.
So I think kind of where things stand today, it seems pretty clear that you're going to have, Jeremy Roach, the Duke transfer, Norchad Omier, the Miami transfer. You're going to have VJ Edgecombe, the true freshman, 5-star, one of the best prospects in the country, going to be a top NBA draft prospect next year as well. And then that last starting spot, I think, will be Jaden Nunn. That's kind of how I view it right now. And then Josh O at center. So that's kind of your five right there. You got Norchad and you got Josh O as your bigs. And then your guards are, VJ, Jeremy, and Jaden Nunn. And so I think when you look at that, it's a good group. I think that, for stretches this year, you're going to see Norchad play the 5 because I think their 5 position is the weakest position on their roster. It's something that we've talked about a lot all offseason. It's something that they're going to have to make up for on the rebounding side. That's like their biggest question mark in my eyes going into the season. But then you look at kind of their depth chart on the bench and you see Langston Love, who is definitely a candidate to be, 6th man of the year in all of college basketball this year. I mean, he's a great player. He just hasn't been able to stay healthy. Right. And then you look at Jalen Celestine, who's the transfer from Cal, really good shooter, long, kind of gives you that Jalen Bridges vibe. So he could potentially play the 4, kind of a hybrid 4 next to Norchad, which would be interesting. And then the guy who's kind of a riser this offseason is the other true freshman, Rob Wright. He'll be the backup point guard. He'll play a lot this year. He's really turned some heads in these preseason games. Yeah. So I'm very curious how that shakes out. But I think that 8 is probably the 8 that you'll mainly see. And then you'll see some other guys like Jason Asamoah, the other super, true freshman, and a few other guys as well. But that 8, I think, is going to be their solid core for this season.
Yeah, so obviously starting tonight with Gonzaga, big non-conference game there. But truthfully, the non-conference schedule is ridiculous. A lot of challenges. You talk about playing Arkansas later this week on Saturday in Dallas at the American Airlines Center. Then there's the St. John's game. But then you talk about UConn. There's a lot of non-conference games. But then you're in the Big 12, right? Like then it's like starting pretty early this year as compared to previous season because there's so many teams in the league now, and it's littered with top 15, top 10 top teams throughout. What are you looking at the schedule? Obviously starting with non-conference, but then once they get into Big 12 play, what their schedule shakes out to be, and what challenges do you see? Like maybe there's a tough stretch that's coming through Big 12 play outside of non-conference, or is it just the non-conference games being so challenging? Because truthfully, I mean, not that you want them to lose to Arkansas, or not that you think you're going to lose to Arkansas, but if you lose to Gonzaga tonight and you potentially lose to Arkansas, like you're talking about a Scott Drew team that doesn't lose a lot of non-conference games, but it sets up like if you lose them, like you can lose a lot of them. And this team might take a little while to gel as well.
That definitely is a possibility. I mean, starting off your season with Gonzaga, who's number 6 in the country, and then number 16 Arkansas, your first 2 games with no tune-up game, no warm-up game, is an intriguing strategy. Not a strategy that I would highly recommend, but one that Scott Drew has no problem facing. He's always scheduled really well. I don't, Baylor's never been one of those programs that's like, we're going to play a whole non-conference schedule and face nobody that's even close to being ranked. Like, they really have never had that approach, which I respect, because there are some teams that are just like, hey, let's stack up with 13 wins in the preseason. That way our record looks good at the end of the year. And so I think that's the better strategy here. I'll also mention they play St. John's, and then if they win that game, they're probably going to have to play Tennessee, which is another really good program, another team that would give you a for sure top 25 win, potentially a top 10 win. I mean, they're going to be really good, and they're very well coached. And the UConn game, the defending back-to-back champs on the road in UConn. I don't think there's a tougher matchup in the country than that one. So they're challenging themselves. Those are the games I'm definitely looking at. You get into Big 12 play, you're going to face a lot of the same teams that everyone else is facing. It's very challenging. I mean, you got Houston, number 4 team in the country, Kansas, number 1 team. Cincy is ranked starting the season. Iowa State's a top 5 team as well. And Arizona's a top 10 team. I mean, this is a loaded conference. It has been, for many, many years. And now it's only getting better because you're adding all these other really good programs. And that's why I think it's foolish when people are like, what's the best conference in the country? It's not even close. And I know some will say the SEC, but no, it's the Big 12 for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, you throw in Arizona this year, and then honestly, what BYU is potentially about to become and what they're doing in NIL and things like that, like it's the headlines are going to be unreal in general. So I'm anxious to see through non-conference. I mean, you start off right at the bat, and not that you're not going to learn anything other than, well, maybe we're a top 25 team if you lose 2 games. Like that's the worst case scenario through the first 2 games. So I'm really anxious. But if you win both of those, then you're talking about, hey, maybe the ceiling's much higher, much quicker than we realized. And with all of that, I think great opportunity to talk about the outlook for this season. You're talking about playing in a league that if you finish in the top 5, you're potentially a 2 or 3 seed for the NCAA tournament, which is crazy to think about. Like, there's 4 or 5 top 10 teams right now in the Big 12 that they're going to be on the schedule that you're facing. So ultimate outlook. I mean, I don't want to say best case, worst case scenario, because obviously best case win a national championship, worst case, like bounce in the first round, I think are the lowest expectation this team should ever have based on the roster. But for you, does this team have the potential to make another Final Four run, especially considering it's going to be in San Antonio this weekend? I mean, this year.
So for me, I think it is important to talk about ceiling and floor. The floor of this team is, I mean, basically what they have been the last couple of years, honestly, where you're, you're right on that 2-3 seed type area of the bracket, and you win the first round game and then lose the second round game. Like, that's probably the floor for this team. And that would be tough, because it's been multiple years in a row. It's been, a couple years here and there where it's just like, why aren't you advancing? Like, need to be going further than that, unable to. And so I guess that goes all the way back to 2022, right? Because they haven't made it to the Sweet 16 since then. So it's a bit of a drought. And so you got to correct that. And so I think for this year's team, I think they have more experience and more guys that have actually, proven, to make a run in the tournament. When you look at Jeremy Roach and Norchad Omier, I mean, these are guys that have played in the biggest moments of the NCAA tournament. Like, they've gotten to the places that Baylor wants to get to this year. I think that's so important. And they're older, like they're old guys. I mean, and I think that really is going to help kind of bring this group together and take them to another level. So a floor is what they have been, even though I truly think they're better than that. Still could happen. But the ceiling is definitely making it to a Final Four. For sure. I mean, if you're one of preseason, Baylor's the top 3 team in the conference, or top 4 team, whatever you want to call it. And anytime you're in that range in the Big 12, you are a Final Four contender for sure. And I think they have all the pieces to make that run happen. My biggest question mark is going to be rebounding. And it's going to be kind of rim protection as well. So if you get into a matchup where you're facing an elite big or a team that rebounds really well and scores in the paint, might be a bit of a tough matchup. But I think in general, Baylor will also have some answers for that. And their 3-point shooting, their ability to spread you out, I think will be one of those answers that, again, could allow them to be very dangerous come tournament time, be very explosive offensively, and potentially make that run in the tournament if you get hot.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about an 8-man rotation. Langston Love's history with injuries, like something like that can impact the NCAA tournament pretty quickly, especially if you get into a tough matchup and you're running thin on with guys who aren't fully healthy at that time of year. So I'm with you. I think the roster wise, it's is as good as we've seen it since that national championship team in terms of overall, guards, wings, bigs. Like I think they have that ability to make those runs. So some quick hitters before we kind of talk about that Gonzaga game briefly tonight. We'll just run through these. Don't spend a ton of time on them, but kind of getting your thought on the roster specifically and what the superlatives in a way are for this team. So let's start with this most underrated player on this Baylor roster for this season.
This one I kind of go back and forth on, right? Because I think, does Langston Love qualify for that? Because I think people think he's really good, but
maybe on the national level.
Yeah, potentially. I think people do underrate him, but I think from a Baylor fan perspective, the guy that's probably going to surprise people the most in my eyes is actually not the one that I think most people would pick, to be honest. I think it's going to be Jalen Celestine. I think that there is something to say about a guy that shoots 41% from three, and it was his first year back from a season-ending injury. So it's like he was still getting his legs back last year. He was still getting kind of everything back to normal a season ago. And now you're telling me Baylor's getting him after shooting 41% at Cal, and he's got all these guards around him and all this attention. Like he's going to look like the fourth option or fifth option every time he's out there. And he's a very good shooter, a guy that I think can get hot at any time and really be kind of like a Jalen Bridges was for Baylor. And we saw that at times where Bridges could just take over games at times and win you games. I think Celestine's going to be like that for this team. I also think the other part that I really think's huge about him is they don't really have another guy like him. The closest guy like him is the true freshman, Jason Asamoah, as far as being able to play the 4 or the 3. They don't have anyone else like that. And so I think that makes him unique and really potentially the guy who comes in, plays the 4 next to Norchad, and maybe that ends up being your best lineup in the lineup that you close games with.
Yeah, if he can ultimately do some of the things that Bridges did defensively at times, being a great transition defender, blocking shots, like takes it to the next level for him specifically. But him shooting the ball is key. I mean, big, he's a mismatch for people. Really anxious to see him on the court. Okay, leading scorer, a lot of guards, a lot of balance. But who are you projecting as the leading scorer for this team?
So this one I kind of go back and forth on because I think Jeremy Roach is going to have a really good year, and I think he's going to compete for this. But I think there's more competition at the guard spot. Like I think they're going to rotate more guys in, so he might not play the necessary amount of minutes. So I'm going to go with the guy that's averaged a double-double since his freshman year of college, and that's Norchad Omier. I think that this is a guy who is basically just going to show up and score 15 points pretty much every time he steps on the court, which is a luxury. Baylor really hasn't had many guys like that in the paint recently who are just like, he's getting 15 points. We'll see how it happens, but most likely it's going to include a few offensive rebounds, a few putbacks, a few dunks, a few transition buckets. Like that's what he does. But I think that safe floor is going to make him be the leading scorer because he will have some games where he has 20-something points as well. He's that kind of player. He's that kind of difference maker, and he's going to be really hard for Baylor to take off the court. And so he's going to play a lot of minutes, especially in the biggest matchups. So I'll go with him.
Okay. Best shooter.
Ooh, that's a good one. I mean, I guess I kind of need to go with the guy that I just mentioned, right? I mean, like, I got to stay consistent here. And we're talking about a 41% 3-point shooter. No one else on this roster has shot 41% from 3 in a season. So I'm going to go with Jalen Celestine. I think he is a very good shooter. I also think he's going to shoot most of his shots from the 3-point line. So you're going to see him taking a lot of threes. Whereas some of these other guys, you'll see them trying to get into the lane and attacking the basket. So I'll go with him.
Okay. If this team makes a run, obviously the national champion, just in general, I mean, who's the ultimate MVP for this team if they were able to go deep into the NCAA tournament? Or who does it need to be is, I guess, maybe that's the best way to put it. Who does it need to be to make that run?
I think so. I personally think that's going to have to be Jeremy Roach. You get into the NCAA tournament and it becomes a guards game. It becomes, how are you going to create your own shot? How are you going to get into the lane? How are you going to finish through contact? and how are you going to control your emotions and really play well at the biggest moments? Jeremy Roach has done that in multiple tournament runs for Duke. I think that it'd be easy to look at VJ Edgecombe and be like, man, if he just plays up to his, draft ability, then it could be him. But I think that's a little tough to rely on a true freshman. I mean, you look at last year's UConn team, Steph Castle, really good player, awesome freshman, ends up going top 5 in the NBA draft. He was not their best guard. He was their third best guard from a scoring standpoint. And so I think that is kind of the blueprint. You need VJ to be great on defense. You need him to be clutch in those moments, knock down shots, like do things. But ultimately, when the games are on the line, I think it's going to run through Jeremy Roach, which means he's going to have to play really well. And he's probably the key for them to make that ultimate run to winning a national championship or just make it into a Final Four.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big reason he was brought in. You mentioned the experience earlier. You want him to be the guy that's taking those shots in big moments, having the ball in his hands. And Scott Drew point guards, that's typically what they do. They have the ball in their hands in big moments. So, all right, tonight, Gonzaga, number 6 preseason game where their Bulldogs are basically favored by 3 to 4 points, maybe 3.5, depending on where you find it. That's where the analytics have them lined up as well. And old team, and we talked about this earlier, old team that they're facing, 6 seniors kind of in their rotation, and that's unheard of in college basketball. And not a lot of them are transfers. I mean, you get the transfers at time. Baylor has some transfers this year that build that senior depth, but they don't have that. How do you see Baylor matching up in this game against Gonzaga? Mark Few, top 10 team versus top 10 team. One team that's very experienced, one that has some, but not a ton.
So, I mean, yeah, Gonzaga has 2 kind of, I guess you'd say, key to our transfers. Leaf Battle from Arkansas and then Michael Ajayi from Pepperdine. And I know Baylor looked at Ajayi for a little bit as well, kind of in that Celestine role. And he's a really good player. He shot 47% from 3 last year. He's a really good player and a guy who's going to be a difference maker for them. This is an interesting game because you are going into a tough environment, and that's going to make this one really tough. I think, when you look at a team that's as old as Gonzaga, they're going to be ready for this moment as well. But they're also adapting to bringing in some new guys. So, they're going to probably have a little bit of rust too. This is the first game for both of these teams. So I think you're going to see some rust in general. But the thing of it is Gonzaga, a lot of people like Gonzaga this season. I mean, they're top, I think they're 6th. That's their preseason ranking right now. Yeah. So, I mean, I know a lot of people like them. I've seen a lot of things about people talking about kind of this experience that they have this year. And Mark Few's a great coach. Lots of respect for him. I mean, I think in general, having a veteran lineup with a coach like that, and then the talent that they have, bringing it all together is going to make them really tough to beat. But ultimately, I think Baylor's roster is better than Gonzaga's. If you just look top to bottom, I don't think it's that close, from a talent standpoint. Now, you bring in the factors of, well, they're all old and you have a really good coach and they're playing basically at home.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe that changes things a little bit. But from a roster standpoint, I think if they played this on a neutral site, Baylor would be favored. I personally think Baylor is the better team, but Gonzaga is a really good team and they're probably going to be a top 15 team all year long.
Yeah. I mean, you look back to the season opener last year, I guess it was against Auburn when Jacoby Walter goes nuts, kind of figured out what Yves Missi makes insane play in that game. You kind of realize, okay, this is what this team's potential is of what all they can do against a pretty good Auburn team. I don't remember what Auburn finished like, but they had a lot coming back. Bruce Pearl did a good job, or has always done a good job there at Auburn. But this is a much different test. This is not a neutral site game by any means against kind of a middle of the pack SEC team that was. It's going to be a challenge. There's no doubt, but that's what you love about Scott Drew. Never going to back down from this type of challenge. Great relationship with Mark Few. To me, making college basketball pop in November, this game's going to get a lot of play and a lot of attention, even though it's such a late tip-off. It's an opportunity for Baylor to kind of advance their brand, for Gonzaga to advance their brand early in the season, followed up with Arkansas later. So, later in the week. It's awesome. It's for Baylor, and especially now with what football's doing, just another chance to kind of build that fan base's esteem back. Go in, even if you don't win, compete, put your brand on national showcase. And I'm really excited to see this Baylor team come together and play this year. A lot of talent. We talked about, you just mentioned the roster, a lot of talent on this team, but great part of the Big 12. you got all this talent. Most conferences, your top 10 teams probably going to win the league. Well, not necessarily in the Big 12. You got about 4 of those that could potentially be in the top 10 and potentially win the league this year starting. But I don't think there's any doubt that Baylor's going to be ready for Big 12 play after this non-conference slate.
Absolutely. And they, obviously have the new development facility as well that they've been practicing in all off season.
Yeah.
They're probably more comfortable in the pavilion as well this year. They only got to play in there for half the year last season. So that'll all be cool factors to kind of think about this year. I will say this Gonzaga game, Gonzaga was a 5.5 point favorite coming into this game, I believe. And it's shrunk down to 2.5. So the money
now? There you go.
Yeah, the money's coming in on Baylor for this game. And I think it's a smart bet. If you want my prediction for this game, I think Baylor's going to win this game in a close one. I think it's actually going to be relatively high scoring as well. Relatively, not extreme, but something like 75-70 is what I'm thinking. Somewhere in that range.
That's the Mark Few recipe. Like you watch Gonzaga play and they're scoring a lot of points. And obviously this Baylor team is talented enough. They're not going to try to slow the game down. This Baylor team won't try to slow it down that much. So, all right, Baylor family, that's going to do it for this episode of Inside Baylor Sports. Thanks to each of you for listening. Make sure you check out our other recap of the TCU football game that's also live throughout the day. Hop on there. Obviously, the football's rolling for Baylor. Basketball season's now here and it's starting. So, have a great Monday and sick 'em Bears.